What's up everybody? Welcome to the third Reddit video on this channel. Today I'll be reading out more unsettling and scary stories. Also, if you're new here, consider subscribing to the channel. Anyway, let's get into the first story. My roommate has been in the shower for more than 4 hours. So I got home at around 11 p.m. Late night at the office turned into an even later night at the bar. About 4 drinks deep at this point, and I'm tired. Just about ready to fall asleep as I stumble through the doorway. I lay down on the couch and reach for my bag of joints and spark one up as I pull YouTube on my laptop. I'm in the middle of watching some luxury cruise tour, close passing out, when I hear the front door open. I sit up and turn my head slightly, just enough to see my roommate coming in. He hangs his jacket in the closet and doesn't say anything and walks slowly to his room, which is normal enough. I'd been living with him for about 3 months, long enough for me to pick up on most of his tendencies. The guy really doesn't talk unless spoken to, which was far from a problem for me. He also generally kept things clean on his end, never causing much in the way of problems. I really couldn't complain. So I go back to watching YouTube, and about 5 minutes later I hear the shower in his room turning on. Once again, nothing strange. At this point, I'm watching bare-knuckle boxing highlights with my eyes half open, maybe 1 or 2 minutes away from passing out. I remembering waking up in darkness, my head hurting, my throat dry as hell. I sat up slowly, waiting for the grogginess to settle into something manageable. Once it did, I grabbed my phone, checked the time. Around 3:30 a.m. from what I remember. I was starving, and so I got up, began walking towards the fridge. And then I noticed it. A soft but ever-present noise in the background. It took me a few seconds to really recognize what it was. The shower. Suddenly, the events of last night began replaying in my head. Drinking at the bar, Ubering home, laptop, couch, my roommate coming home, the shower turning on. I stood there for a while trying to make sense of it. Maybe he went to bed and forgot to turn it off? I shook my head. There's no way that happened, I thought. Maybe he slipped and fell? Realizing the implications of this, I rushed towards his room, but found his bathroom door locked. I began pounding on it. "Hey man, you all right?" No response. I considered kicking the door down, but decided to call 911 before I did that. I took my phone out, preparing to dial, when I noticed that I had an unread text, one from my roommate. "Hey man, I couldn't sleep, so I went over to my girlfriend's place. Not sure when I'll be back." Sent 2 hours ago. I look at the bathroom door, then back down at my phone. Everything about this was wrong. First of all, my roommate barely texts me, and certainly never to tell me that he's going out. Second of all, I know for a fact that he's single and has been for a while. And third of all, who the fuck was in the shower then? I tried calling him. No answer. Sent him some texts, but no response. I walked over to his desk and saw that his keys and wallet were still beside his laptop. My head's starting to spin at this point, and I get out of there, go back into the living room, and turn on the lights. I'm pacing around in a circle, trying to follow the plot, while also trying to ignore the shower, a noise that I never could have imagined being so dreadful in any context. Sometime later, I hear something vibrating on the kitchen counter. I move towards it and see that it's a phone. My roommate's phone. The panic begins setting in, and immediately I grab my keys and run out of the apartment. I make my way down the hall and take the stairs down to the lobby, but even that doesn't seem far enough away, and so I make my way over to the McDonald's across the street. I sit there for a while, considering calling the cops, but for some reason feeling too nervous to do so. But even though there's hardly anybody in there, the place begins to feel suffocating, and I decide to leave, walking back out onto the empty streets. Almost immediately, I get this feeling that I'm being watched, and I feel my gaze drifting up and towards the apartment. Soon, I'm looking at my balcony, and I see somebody standing there. A dark figure stood completely straight, stiff to the point where it nearly resembles a mannequin. But it isn't one. If I look closely, I can see it just slightly swaying. I froze in place, my mind hardly able to understand or accept what it was seeing. It's not my roommate. It's too tall. In fact, it's too tall to be anybody I know. Its head nearly scraping the bottom of the balcony above. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out any of its details. The darkness and distance may have been enough to explain that away, but there was something about it that drove me towards a different conclusion, that this thing simply possessed no details that could have been observed, that the only element of its composition was that of unadulterated darkness. Of course, my gut instinct was to get the hell away from it, but the voice in my head was telling me that if I were to try and run, this thing would end up following me. I went back into the McDonald's instead, locking myself in the bathroom as I finally dialed 911. I told the operator that somebody had broken into my place, but that I had gotten out of there without them noticing, but that they were still in there. It was the story that most accurately represented the situation without making me come across as batshit. The operator told me that they'd be sending somebody over for me to hang tight. I left the bathroom waiting at the table closest to the exit until I could see the red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. I went outside to meet the cops, looking up at the balcony to find it empty, though the door to the living room had been left open. They pelted me with a bunch of questions that I found difficult to answer. Is the intruder armed? Do I have an idea who it might be? What are their intentions? I told them I didn't know, that I couldn't figure it out, but they just kept on asking. Soon, I was practically yelling at them to go up there and check it out for themselves, and I suppose the terror in my voice was enough for them to begin taking this seriously. They told me to wait by the entrance, and I watched on as they entered the building. I was out there for a long time, growing increasingly anxious at the thought of what they were going to tell me when they came down. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by a single, muffled gunshot. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I continued to wait there, unsure of what to do otherwise. 20 more minutes of silence and the officers still hadn't come down. Soon, I could hear more of them approaching in the distance. Before I knew it, 4 more cop cars had pulled up around me, and the scene had fallen into chaos. Officers shouting over each other and into their radios, more questions being hurled my way, none of which I was able to answer. The next few sequences were mostly a blur, but I remember the building being evacuated, the tenants frightened and confused as they were ushered outside while the officers became more and more frantic. I remembered hearing more scattered gunshots, some screaming, other noises that were difficult to make sense of. There were a few lapses in my memory after that, but I recall being pushed into the back of a police car. After being driven to the station, I was led into one of the interrogation rooms where I found 2 nondescript men in suits waiting for me. They didn't introduce themselves and immediately went into a series of questions, each one more bizarre than the last. What company was your roommate employed by? What was the nature of his job? How many different people have been inside your apartment since your roommate moved in? Have you ever heard voices inside the apartment from the hours of midnight to 3 a.m.? Voices that did not belong to your roommate? Have you ever seen a circle of people standing outside of the apartment from the hours of midnight to 3 a.m.? People that were exceptionally tall? And one of the most unsettling ones, have you ever seen somebody standing at the foot of your bed upon waking up between the hours of midnight to 3 a.m., only for them to disappear moments later? If so, do you remember what they looked like? Any distinct features? As they continued probing me, my mind began conjuring up some of the strange shit that had happened after my roommate had moved in. Shit that I had written off as figments of my imagination, simply because I had no other explanation for them. I did hear the voices, always coming from the room next to mine where my roommate slept. I was always so tired when I heard them, but I do remember it either sounding like a young woman or a man with an extremely deep voice. I could never make out any words. It always sounded like gibberish. And then there was that one time where I went to the bathroom in the middle of the night. Still half asleep, I didn't bother turning the lights on as I entered. But as my eyes began adjusting to the dark, I could have sworn that somebody was already sitting on the toilet. Somebody extremely tall. Of course, when I turned on the lights, nothing was there. It was easy to chalk it up as a product of late-night drowsiness at the time, and I had never really thought about it since. After doing my best to give them useful information, the suits spent a good few minutes taking notes on their phones. Once they were done, they sat up quickly, told me that they'd be in touch before leaving the room. A cop came in a few minutes later and told me that since I couldn't return to the apartment, they would set me up in a nearby hotel until they were able to get the situation under control, and that I should stay put until they gave me a call. "What happened?" I asked him. "What did you guys find up there?" He stared at me for a long time, not as if he were deep in thought, but as if he held deep aversion for what he was considering telling me. Eventually, he just shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "I mean, I really don't know." I nodded, tried to smile, though I'm sure it didn't come across very well. It's the next day now, and I'm in the hotel. Of course I couldn't sleep. Couldn't really eat. The officer hasn't called me yet. When I try searching up information about the evacuation on the internet, all I can find are articles claiming that it was due to a fire. A fucking fire. Update. I fell asleep and I just woke up. It's 1 a.m. now, and I can hear the shower. I should have died 10 years ago. I have a murderer to thank for my life. When I was 13 and an idiot, like most 13-year-olds are, I spent a lot of time on a now-defunct app called Chatterbox. It operated a lot like a more clunky version of Discord, where you could chat with strangers online, either through community groups or private messages. For context, I should mention that I was a bit of a troubled teenager. I grew up in a dysfunctional household with largely absent parents, and I was bullied pretty severely all throughout middle school. I found solace in one particular Chatterbox community called Teens X Fashion, which, as I'm sure you can guess, was a place to discuss fashion and aesthetic trends of the mid-2010s. It was supposed to be a place for people aged 13, 18, but now that I'm older and wiser, I'm pretty sure that 90% of the people I met on that server were much older guys. Through the server, I met a 17-year-old guy named Jack. I don't remember his Chatterboxix username, but I remember him being a kind and charismatic presence in our community. We talked almost every day for 2 years, and he quickly became my #1 confidant. From the time I entered high school at age 14, the bullying got worse, as did my home situation. And though I was never diagnosed by a professional, I'm pretty sure I was depressed. I began having some suicidal thoughts, and when I told Jack about them, he seemed sympathetic. I don't blame you. This world is such a shit show. I think about ending things sometimes too. I was pleased that he, unlike my school guidance counselor and the few other people I told about my thoughts, didn't just brush them off and promise me things would get better. I found myself oddly charmed by his candidness. "You're still pretty young." He texted me once. "Maybe wait a year or so. Give life another try. If it hasn't gotten any better by then, let's talk some more." I took his advice and waited for things to get better, but I saw no light at the end of the tunnel. By the time I was 15, I'd dropped out of high school, I barely left my room, and I was having trouble performing basic tasks like brushing my teeth. When I told Jack about my state, he said, "Honestly, I haven't been doing well either. I bought some cyanide pills a few months back, just waiting for the right time." I was surprised to hear this. Jack had always seemed like a pretty happy-go-lucky guy. After thinking about what he said for a few weeks and doing some research on the pills he mentioned, I asked if I could buy a few off of him, just in case, and he agreed. I suggested he ship them to me, but after some discussion, I was shocked to learn that we both lived in the same state. I didn't want to give him my home address, the only intelligent thought I had throughout this whole ordeal. And so we agreed to meet in a public place, a coffee shop about an hour away from where I lived. A few weeks later, our agreed-upon meeting date rolled around, and I took the bus to the coffee shop. I had the selfies he'd posted to Teens X Fashion as reference, but when I entered the shop and looked around, I didn't see anyone who vaguely resembled the pictures. I walked around, figuring he must be late, before I heard someone shout my name from the corner table. I looked at the man who'd called out to me. It had to be Jack. No one else would know my name, but he looked different. He was much taller and heavier than he appeared in the photos, and much older as well. It was difficult to tell what age he was exactly, but he certainly wasn't 19. I walked over and asked his name, and he gave me both the name Jack and his Chatterbox handle. He gave me a friendly smile as I sat across from him. He wasn't a bad-looking guy, and he seemed to have put a lot of effort into his appearance for our meeting, but I was thrown off by the discrepancy in how old he was supposed to be and how old he appeared. Before we'd said much to one another, a barista came over to take our order, which in retrospect was unusual for a coffee shop. The barista's name was Lydia, and she was this petite blonde lady, probably 21 at most. She took our order and then left us to a very awkward, stilted conversation. I didn't know what to say. I'd been excited to meet my friend of 2 years, but now that I was actually there, it all felt like too much. I was so quiet that Jack seemed to take offense after a while. "Hey," he said at one point. I hadn't even realized I was averting my eyes from his, but when I looked up at him, he was giving me this weird, almost pitiful look. "You're mad because I gained weight, aren't you? You think I'm ugly?" I was taken aback. "No," I said. "I don't think you're ugly at all." He seemed genuinely upset. All of a sudden, I felt like a terrible person, like I was taking advantage of him or something. I rushed to console him, partially because I was worried that he wouldn't give me the pills, but also because he was pretty much the only friend I had, and I was terrified of ruining things. Soon, I was the one leading the conversation, pulling him back out of his shell little by little. It was all very odd. The barista came back after a while. I said thank you as she put our drinks down, but she didn't leave afterwards. She just kept standing there, looking at us with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "All good here, folks?" Lydia asked, staring directly at me. I told her everything was great, and then she reluctantly returned to the counter. Jack and I finished our drinks, largely in silence. I remember very strongly not wanting to look directly at his face. Like I said, he wasn't a bad-looking guy, but his eyes seemed unnaturally dull, like the light wasn't hitting them right or something. Once we'd finished drinking, and Jack still hadn't made any mention of the pills, I broached the topic myself. "They're in my car," he said in response to my inquiry. He leaned his face close to mine and lowered his voice, giving me a wink that was anything but charming. "We might both get in trouble if I handed you a bag of pills in a public space like this." I guessed that made sense, so we tossed our drinks and I followed him outside. The parking lot was full of people, not exactly a prime location for a child abduction, so I didn't have any second thoughts about walking with him. But when we reached the last row of cars and Jack kept going, I slowed down. "Oh, I'm parked a ways down the road," he said when I asked where he was going. He gave a condescending little laugh, like I'd asked him a stupid question. "Again, I can't be handing you cyanide pills in front of everyone, silly." I stopped walking. I was starting to think that I didn't know this person as well as I'd thought, and I certainly didn't want to be alone with him in an isolated area. But then again, did I even care what happened to me? Wasn't I ready to go anyways? Jack noticed that I'd stopped. He turned around and walked back over to me, placing a meaty, sweaty hand on my shoulder. Even in the direct sunlight, his eyes looked strangely dark. "Come on now," he said gruffly, and started guiding me further from the parking lot. It was then that I realized that, despite all my misgivings about the world, I really did still care what happened to me. I didn't want to be hurt. I didn't want to die. I raised an arm and tried to push Jack's hand off my shoulder, but he tightened his grip so hard I thought he was about to break a bone. I thought I was done for before a shout from behind us startled us both. "Hey, stop right now." I turned my head towards the parking lot and saw the barista from earlier running towards us at full speed. "You stop right there." Now this woman was maybe 4'11", and I'm pretty sure Jack could have picked her up and thrown her like a football if he wanted to. But her voice was loud and strong, and as she yelled out, she attracted a lot of attention. As soon as he realized we'd been spotted, he let go of my shoulder and made a run for it, Lydia came to a stop next to me, taking my hand and gently guiding me back towards the group of witnesses in the parking lot. Once we'd made it to safety, she called the police, who arrived quickly to take our statements. However, after listening to my whole story, they ended up taking me to the station for questioning. Lydia came along with me, which made me feel a lot better. To make a long story short, the man I'd met up with was not a 19-year-old named Jack, but a 38-year-old named John Davis Harrison, who the police were able to identify from photos Lydia had taken at the coffee shop. He was arrested the following day after police found the skeletal remains of 2 women and 1 man stuffed between the mattress and the box springs of his bed. Harrison admitted to luring his victims, all of whom had confided their suicidal thoughts in him, with the promise of a quick death via cyanide pills. In reality, the slow, painful deaths his victims endured at his hands were etched into their bones. The whole ordeal was the wake-up call of the century for me. In the aftermath, I went back to high school and started to really apply myself in class. I graduated a year late, but I also graduated with really high marks. I started seeing an awesome therapist at age 16, and thanks to him and a few counselors at my school, I transitioned into a foster family that is now my adoptive family. I actually enjoy living these days, and despite the title of this post, I have not a murderer but one brave barista to thank for my life now. We still keep in touch, and I'm happy to report that she's doing well too. Thanks, Lydia, for looking out for a clueless kid who didn't know what they were getting themselves into. Now that I'm older and wiser, I promise to do the same. Anyway, that's the end of this story. If you made it up to here, thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more stories like this one.